In September of 1958, a Soviet cartographer named Aleksei Voronov arrived at a remote village in western Siberia. His assignment was routine. Update the regional maps. Count the buildings. Record any structural changes. Move on. He had spent almost 15 years doing exactly that. There was nothing unusual about Kholodny Kamen. At least, that's what he believed before he arrived there. The village sat deep in the Siberian interior, several hours from the nearest railway line. It had existed for more than 2 centuries. According to regional records, more than 300 people lived there. Farmers, teachers, children, war veterans, ordinary people. To understand what was lost in Kholodny Kamen, you have to understand who lived there. There was a schoolteacher named Tatyana Morova. She was 44 years old. Former students later described her as strict but kind. She kept a small jar of hard candy in her desk drawer. Students who answered questions correctly got 1 piece. She had been teaching in Kholodny Kamen for 16 years. She never applied for a transfer. Not once. There was a man named Pyotr Galkin. He ran the collective farm. He had fought in the Second World War as a young man and came back quieter than he left. Neighbors said he rarely talked about the war. But every year on Victory Day, he would walk alone to the edge of the village and stand there for a long time before returning home. No one ever asked him what he was thinking about. No one needed to. There was an elderly woman named Agrafena Sleptsova. She was 87 years old. She had been born in Kholodny Kamen. She had never left it. According to her neighbors, she could predict the weather by listening to the wind move through the chapel bell. She had a daughter in Novosibirsk she had not seen in 11 years. Distance was different then. And there were children. Dozens of them. Children who had never seen a city. Children who knew every path through the surrounding forest by memory. Children whose handwriting was still on the schoolhouse chalkboard when Voronov arrived. These were not extraordinary people. They were not important people in the way governments define importance. They were simply people who had built a life in a difficult place. And on the night of August 29, 1958, they were gone. All of them. But when Voronov reached the village on the morning of September 3rd, something immediately felt wrong. Not damaged. Not abandoned. Wrong. The buildings were standing exactly where they should have been. The gardens had been watered recently. Fresh water still sat in metal buckets outside several homes. And inside the houses, there was food on the tables. Still warm. Bowls of soup. Half-cut bread. Tea beside open books. In one home, he found a jacket hanging beside the front door as if someone had just returned from outside moments earlier. But no one was there. Voronov later wrote that the silence was the first thing that truly frightened him. Not because the village was quiet, but because it should not have been quiet. There should have been voices. Animals. Footsteps. Children running between the houses. Instead, there was only wind. He called out several times. No answer. At first, he assumed the villagers were working nearby. But as he walked from house to house, the feeling became impossible to ignore. Something had interrupted ordinary life in the middle of an ordinary evening. And whatever it was, it had happened fast. Inside one home, he found potatoes half-peeled beside a kitchen knife. In another, he found a chess game abandoned mid-match. At the village schoolhouse, lessons were still written across the chalkboard. Children's coats hung neatly beside the entrance. At the medical station, a patient file sat open on the desk. The final sentence ended halfway through a word. As if the doctor had suddenly stopped writing. Voronov searched the entire village. Every house. Every barn. Every storage building. Nothing. No bodies. No blood. No signs of violence. And according to the written account he would later give decades afterward, there were no footprints leading away from the village. Not one. This detail would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because the ground surrounding Kholodny Kamen had been softened by recent rain. 300 people could not leave a village without leaving traces behind. But there were no traces. Not near the river. Not near the road. Not beyond the tree line. Nothing. It was as if the entire population had vanished where they stood. Voronov spent nearly 6 hours searching the surrounding wilderness. He checked the northern farming paths, the nearby riverbank, the forest beyond the eastern ridge. Nothing. No carts. No tracks. No clothing. No bodies frozen in the snow. Just emptiness. And according to Voronov, the emptiness felt recent. That detail appeared again and again in later interviews. He said the village did not feel dead. It felt interrupted. Like he had arrived moments after something had happened. Something he was never meant to see. One detail from Voronov's account was rarely discussed publicly. The animals. Several dogs remained chained outside homes when he arrived. But according to Voronov, none of them barked when he approached. They watched him silently. One dog reportedly whimpered and pulled backward when Voronov attempted to enter the village chapel. The chapel itself disturbed him more than any other building. Kholodny Kamen's small Orthodox church had survived decades of Soviet anti-religious campaigns simply because the village was too remote for authorities to care. Inside, Voronov found every candle in the building burned completely down. Wax covered the wooden floor beneath the altar. Someone had lit every candle in the chapel. Not over several days. All at once. Or close to it. Voronov later admitted that this detail frightened him enough that he left the chapel almost immediately. Years later, he would tell Palchev that the air inside the building felt unusually warm despite the Siberian cold outside. He never fully explained what he meant by that. By nightfall, Voronov returned to the regional administration office and filed his report. What happened next disturbed him almost as much as the village itself. Within 48 hours, officials from Moscow arrived in the region. Not local police. Not military personnel. Men in civilian clothing. They never identified themselves. According to Voronov, they spoke very little. They asked precise questions. They confiscated his written report almost immediately. Then they traveled directly to Kholodny Kamen. The team remained there for 4 days. When they left, they took everything. Patient records. School documents. Church papers. Farm ledgers. Even the chalkboards from the schoolhouse were removed. But years later, Voronov admitted something else disturbed him about the men from Moscow. They never once asked where the villagers had gone. Not once. According to him, they seemed far more interested in one thing. What he had seen. At one point during questioning, one of the men reportedly asked Voronov whether he had entered the chapel before sunset. Voronov never understood why. He later said the question bothered him for decades. According to Voronov, the men gave him the uncomfortable feeling that they already knew what had happened before they arrived. The explanation they eventually provided was simple. Administrative relocation. Routine procedure. Nothing unusual. But Voronov knew that was impossible. People preparing for relocation do not leave hot food on their tables. They do not abandon animals in locked pens. And they do not disappear without footprints. For more than 30 years, Voronov said nothing publicly. In the Soviet Union, silence was often a survival instinct. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Old archives began opening. Forgotten records resurfaced. And for the first time in decades, people who had spent their lives staying silent began talking. Voronov was already an old man by then. He contacted a historian named Dmitry Palchev and finally gave a complete account of what he had seen in Kholodny Kamen. Palchev initially assumed the story had to be exaggerated. Then he began searching for the village itself. And that was when the case became even stranger. Because according to Soviet records, Kholodny Kamen did not exist. No census data. No school registration. No agricultural records. No church documents. No regional maps. Nothing. A village that had supposedly existed for over 200 years had been completely erased from the bureaucratic system of the Soviet Union. Palchev later wrote that removing people from official history was not unusual for totalitarian governments. But removing an entire settlement was something else entirely. Especially a settlement with more than 300 residents. Even more disturbing were the maps. Palchev reportedly located 3 separate military survey maps printed before 1958 that appeared to show structures in the area matching Voronov's descriptions. But later versions of the same maps had been altered. Roads disappeared. Building markers vanished. Entire terrain references had been removed. It was as if someone had attempted to cut the village out of history itself. He eventually located references to nearby geographic markers matching Voronov's descriptions. Most importantly, he identified the granite outcropping standing near the village. The locals called it the Cold Stone. And according to several indigenous Khanty elders interviewed during the 1990s, the place had carried a reputation long before Russian settlers arrived there. The Khanty believed the stone marked a boundary point between worlds. A place where reality became thin. According to Palchev's interviews, warnings had been passed down through generations. Warnings not to settle too close to the stone. Warnings that certain nights of the year were dangerous there. One elder reportedly told him something Palchev never forgot. There are places where the world opens. And there are places where it remembers being open. August 29, the night the villagers disappeared, reportedly aligned with an important date in the Khanty lunar calendar. Skeptics dismissed the connection immediately. And to be fair, there are more rational explanations. Some researchers believe Kholodny Kamen may have been connected to a classified Soviet experiment. Western Siberia during the late 1950s contained numerous military facilities and research programs hidden from the public. A chemical exposure. A biological accident. Mass evacuation under secrecy. These explanations would account for Moscow's rapid response and the removal of official records. But they still fail to answer the central question. Where did everyone go? Because even disasters leave evidence. Bodies. Vehicles. Mass graves. Kholodny Kamen left nothing. Another theory proposes some form of collective psychological event. A mass panic. A shared delusion. 300 people walking together into the Siberian wilderness during the night. But this explanation collapses under its own weight. Children. Elderly residents. Entire families. No footprints. No remains. No survivors. And Siberia always leaves traces. Always. The wilderness may hide bodies for years. But it does not erase people completely. Aleksei Voronov spent the final years of his life thinking about Kholodny Kamen almost constantly. Friends later claimed he became increasingly withdrawn after giving his testimony to Palchev. In one of his final recorded interviews, he was asked a simple question. What frightened him most? The silence? The disappearance? The possibility of a cover-up? Voronov reportedly sat quietly for nearly a minute before answering. Then he said, "The empty village was not the frightening part." He paused again. "What frightened me was the feeling that I had arrived too early." According to the interviewer, Voronov became visibly uncomfortable after saying this. Then he added one final sentence. "A place can feel empty. But Kholodny Kamen did not feel empty. It felt watched." Aleksei Voronov died in 1998. Dmitry Palchev visited the site believed to be Kholodny Kamen only once. He never returned. And according to notes discovered among Palchev's personal documents after his death, the final Soviet map printed before the disappearance still showed one structure standing beyond the edge of the village. A building Voronov never mentioned. A building marked only as observation point. No surviving government file has ever explained what the structure was. No photographs of it have ever surfaced publicly. And according to Palchev's notes, the building no longer appeared on any maps printed after 1958. Today, the coordinates where Kholodny Kamen supposedly stood are absent from most modern maps. The cold stone still exists. The village does not. No confirmed photographs of Kholodny Kamen have ever surfaced publicly. No government files explaining the disappearance have ever been released. And somewhere inside whatever institution sent those nameless men into Siberia in September of 1958, there may still be a document explaining exactly what happened in that village. Or perhaps there is no explanation at all. Because some places disappear. And some places erase themselves.